book of Exodus, chapter 1, verse 8, there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. It's a simple line, the implications of which set off generations of suffering and set the Jewish people on a course for liberation, creating a narrative central to both the Jewish and Christian stories. There's nothing simple about the Exodus story. I've taken 2 full semester courses on this single book, and it still feels like there's just more to excavate. Because it's so rich, I'm really not going to be able to get into any depth, but just for the sake of memory, here are the basics. Many of the descendants of Abraham were in Egypt, following Joseph, son of Jacob, himself son of Isaac. Joseph had become a trusted advisor to the Pharaoh, and his descendants were living in Egypt in peace. But there arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph and decided to enslave the group, fearing their difference. That slavery got worse and worse, creating tremendous pain and suffering. Pharaoh was afraid there were too many of them, so he ordered the boys to be drowned at birth. To save her son, one woman sent him down the river rather than letting him be killed. Moses was raised by Pharaoh's daughter, but as an adult, he saw the treatment of the Jewish people and killed an Egyptian to stop him from hurting a slave. Afraid of the consequence, he went to live in the hills where he found a new family. Suffering for the enslaved continued and reportedly even got worse, and the people cried out for help. God heard them and appeared to Moses in a burning bush and told Moses he'd have to go to Pharaoh to convince him to let the slaves go. Moses tried, but Pharaoh had none of it. God backs him up with 9 plagues, telling Moses to warn Pharaoh each time, if you don't let my people go, you'll be overwhelmed with frogs or locusts or some other terrible thing is going to happen. And every prediction came true, but nothing changed. God then goes for the 10th. He threatens the life of every newborn son. And again, Pharaoh doesn't believe him. So God sends the angel of death to any home that isn't occupied by a Hebrew family. The Hebrews had been warned to smear lamb's blood on their door, letting death pass over them. Horrified, Pharaoh lets the Hebrew people leave. He tells them, just go and go quickly. They have a few hours to gather their things, not enough time even to bake bread for the trip, so they make unleavened bread and get out. Before the end of the day, though, Pharaoh changes his mind, sends his soldiers after them, and as the story has it, God parts the Red Sea for the Jews, but brings it back over the Egyptians, who drown, ultimately setting the Hebrew people free. So this is the central story of Judaism. I would argue that it's nearly as important for Christianity. This is the story that creates the Jewish people. Before heading into the desert, they were loosely affiliated, sort of bands of family groups, tribes who were slaves together and had some common ancestry, but were not a single people. It's the escape and the time spent together in the desert that made them one nation. But while this is a defining political and ultimately historical moment, it's also a defining theological moment. Boiled down, the story can be understood with this simple outline. There is a class struggle. God hears the cry of the oppressed. God takes sides. God calls people to partner in their liberation. We'll start with a class struggle. This isn't a spiritual struggle. The struggle isn't up for question. Nothing in Scripture tells us or suggests in any way that people deserve enslavement. Making them a slave class was a power move, and these people were victims to it. And the struggle is grounded in the reality that some people have money and position and others don't and have no way of getting it. They are institutionally guaranteed to never break free from their current reality, that of generational enslavement. More importantly, God knows. God hears the cry of the oppressed. God isn't detached or otherwise contemplating God's divine nature. God is fully aware that people are enslaved and they are suffering and they need help. And here's where it gets interesting. God takes sides. This isn't the God of good people on both sides. This is the God of that side's right and this one is wrong. It's the God of those are my people. And when you do this, you are not. Germans during First World War had belt buckles that claimed God with us. And it turns out, not so much. Football teams all pray to God for help, both sides, right? God on our side. I've heard of plenty of wealthy people. In fact, I've had plenty of wealthy people say directly to me that given their level of privilege, God must love them a little extra. What Scripture actually tells us, though, is that God is on the side of the oppressed. This central story makes clear God's people are the ones who cry out in pain. Not the enslavers who have power, but the powerless, the enslaved, the poor, the suffering. In this very real, very political system of economic oppression and massive violation of human rights, God has chosen a side. This is where you use perk up. God calls people to help in their own liberation. The God of the Exodus does some very cool things like plagues and that sea parting, but that's not the whole story. God calls Moses to start with. Right? Moses sees a burning bush. He has this nearly unprecedented experience of talking with God. But when God tells Moses, I need you to free my people, Moses says no. He says, I'm not your guy. You want someone without a stutter. You want someone who's just a better representative all around. And God isn't having any of that. Everyone is called. Everyone is necessary. God tells Moses, don't worry about it. You're not alone. And Moses isn't alone, right? None of us is alone. Everyone has to step up. Everyone has to do their part. That's how this works. And it does work. The people escape. The story doesn't end there, but the massive mobilization of tens or hundreds of thousands of people out of slavery to freedom does happen. About 3,400 years later, it happens again, right here in this country, when the people with power and money enslaved a group they considered outsiders. Again, the people cried out in their suffering. God heard their cry. God chose sides. God called the people to aid in their liberation. And again, the people were freed. For enslaved people, the enslaved people who were here, connecting with the ancient Jewish story was a critical part of what worked for them. Using the language and the mythology of the oppressors, enslaved Americans could hold up the hypocrisy while also gaining their inspiration through the story of a liberated people and the God who chose their side in the struggle. God hears the cry of the oppressed. God takes sides. People are called to partner in the fight for liberation. This story is as old as history gets, and it's as alive and necessary now as it was in the Bronze Age. Americans thought we were moving past slavery in the 19th century, but there's a group explicitly named that was not part of the ban on forced labor without pay. The 13th Amendment ended the institution of slavery. Passed in 1865, it reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Actually, it's not what it says. Does anyone know what's missing? Here's the full text. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party has been duly convicted, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Except as punishment for crime. That's the catch. It's a huge one for nearly 2 million Americans currently incarcerated. And so we're clear, 38% of them are black. 13% of Americans are black. 38% of prisoners are black. Across the system from beginning to end, black people are given the worst outcomes, while white people are treated in more humane or reasonable ways. Black people don't commit more crimes, but they are imprisoned more often, are given longer sentences, leading to the disproportionate number of black people in our prison industrial complex. Once in prison, slavery is again legal. In fact, the minimum annual value of prison output is $2 billion. Private companies and governments extract nearly free labor from incarcerated people who are employed to do everything from building office furniture and making hand sanitizer to staffing call centers and performing 3D modeling, in most cases for pennies an hour. In California, incarcerated people battle fires in 24-hour shifts for $2.90 a day. That's 12 cents an hour. While black codes and chain gangs have faded into history, incarcerated people remain an easily exploitable labor source because desperate conditions compel many to accept work for just about any pay to alleviate some of the misery of their circumstances. God hears the cry of the oppressed. God chooses sides. God calls people to aid in their own liberation. It's an ancient story with a necessary and contemporary message. There are now 435 anti-LGBTQ bills in the United States. 435. That's almost 10 different bills in the 44 states currently debating them. 2 were passed into law just this week. 24 laws had already hit the books in the last few months. These bills are designed to undermine and weaken non-discrimination laws by allowing employers, businesses, and even hospitals to refuse equal treatment or even turn away LGBTQ people. Conservative lawmakers are fighting our constitutional safeguards to free expression for LGBTQ people by limiting access to books about them or banning performances where they can most be themselves. Trans children and youth are being prevented from participating in school activities, while teachers are being forced to out LGBTQ students. Some of these bills are limiting access to public accommodations like bathrooms and locker rooms, even in schools and workplaces. Imagine going to work and you can't use the bathroom. Some of the bills passed make it a criminal act to provide gender-affirming health care, charging both doctors and parents, creating a hellscape for hundreds of families. I mean, the list goes on. The Don't Say Gay bill in Florida prevents teachers from talking about sexual orientation, and the new law in Kentucky forbids schools from using a child's preferred pronoun unless it conforms to an unedited birth certificate. These are the oppressed of our time. These are the people who God can hear, whose side God is choosing. Here's an interesting thing for all of us to note. For one moment, just find your compassion. Find compassion in your bodies right now. Ask yourself, how much do you care about those who are incarcerated? Ask yourself how much you care about LGBTQ people. See if you can just feel that compassion. If you are not or have never been directly affected, are you still able to access empathy? Is that empathy so accessible you might even be moved to action? It's always interesting to me how humans put ourselves into a story. In the Exodus were the Hebrews escaping from bondage. At the very least were the allies and accomplices, people like Pharaoh's daughter who saves Moses from the river. And the story of American enslavement and liberation usually puts people as the enslaved or the abolitionists. We're never the passive onlooker, never the detached observer. We're certainly never the enslaver, the oppressed, the bad guy. My theory is when something is actually happening, we find it easy to other the people who are oppressed, which shifts us away from compassion and toward either indifference or active harm, but we never imagine ourselves that way. I mean, speaking for myself too, I never imagine myself, even as a passive onlooker. And yet most of us don't act. We might even find it difficult to experience any emotional connection. We always assume ourselves to be the good guy and the hero in every story. I'm sure everyone targeting LGBTQ people are Jewish or Christian, people who love the Exodus story. I'm betting everyone in the criminal justice system does too. They don't see themselves as the oppressor. If anything, God is on their side. Which brings me back to the very first line. There arose a Pharaoh who knew not Joseph. Joseph was trusted. He was one of us. His descendants are part of the tribe. But this Pharaoh didn't know that. He didn't know Joseph. He didn't know the story. He only saw outsiders, people who were different. And that's when oppression is easy. It's easy for those in power to marginalize a group when the majority of the people don't identify with them. They are criminals. They are transgender. They are different. As long as there's a they, we can other them. God hears the cry of the oppressed. God chooses sides. God calls the people to aid in their liberation. This is the central story of Jewish history. It is the story that defines all of Jewish life and ultimately becomes critical in the Christian story. Two world religions encompassing billions of people. It's an ancient story with a very real, very contemporary implication. It is today our story. It is the story of this week. It is the story of our faith. It is the story that compels and propels us. God hears the cry of the oppressed. God takes sides. God calls us to fight for liberation.